Hello, and welcome back to another episode of International Immersion, a podcast where we seek to connect various people, culture, and ideas from around the world and create an environment where people can learn about them to a greater extent and just learn more about the world and explore what else is out there. So for today's episode, I have my father back, and we're going to continue our series about his travels and experiences overseas. And we thought it'd be a good topic today to talk about the early years, and particularly his initial trips, how he got the opportunity, and more importantly, focusing on his time in Taiwan, where those overseas trips really kind of manifested at first before they kind of panned out from there. So, Dad, it's really good to have you back, and excited to talk about this today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. So Dad, so you've been telling me, you told me a lot about what you did, from the late 80s up into the mid 2000s while you were actually going overseas. So, and you mentioned that when you first started doing that, you primarily would go to Taiwan, and mainland China was more of the secondary portion of those trips as well.
Yeah, that's correct. When back in '89, as I had mentioned on the previous program, Korea was like where we started, but the whole industry, primarily in popular price footwear for the discount chains, was moving away from Korea to Taiwan. So, the subsequent trips after that first one primarily were based in Taiwan. And that's where I really got the majority of my early experience, with, Asian culture, that particular part of the world was Taiwan.
I see. Okay. So, we kind of touched on this on the last video. You got the opportunity when you started working for the one company in St. Louis, correct?
Yes. Right out of college. So I was, I got my degree from St. Louis University in a bachelor's in fine arts, which included design. So I had, during that, I think it was my senior year, part of my senior year, was an intern there. Got a job through a friend of mine who also went to school at SLU. So he ended up moving on to something else, and I kind of filled his intern slot. And when I graduated, they offered me a job.
There you go.
So it was like, as an entry-level designer, doing, what I was trained to do in college, but then working with a number of different people who had been what they called old shoe dogs at that time, was mentored into, the styles and processes and operations associated with, designing, footwear, primarily athletic footwear, but it did branch out later on into casual, hiking, children's shoes, eventually things like the lighted shoes, Mutant Ninja Turtles and things like that. But that was later on. So, the first year I was there was primarily just in a designer role, which took my direction from what they called line builders, building lines of product, whether it was specific gender or specific age group, whatever it may be. But it wasn't until I got the opportunity to become an assistant line builder under a particular mentor, which I believe is still with this company. It was Elam Polo, not to be confused with Ralph Lauren. But it was an import company that was, as we talked about before, a middleman or developer, that had relationships overseas, as well as connections within the retail market here in the United States, primarily Payless shoe stores, Kmart, their shoe departments, Walmart as they were up and coming, and then a lot of other mom pop chains, throughout the United States that have either consolidated or have completely gone away at this point in time. But back then, the what we called the client base was pretty diverse. And even within our level of the business, it was, we did everything from things that were considered to be very, commodity based products to things that were a little bit more expensive and a little bit more specific, like hiking boots, or what they called back then coaches shoes, which were a little more casual but still athletic, that kind of thing.
And so a wide range of different a wide range of shoes and different designs and different and like you said, much more of a diverse client base for those products as unlike today where the chains, the larger mega companies, more or less dominate that now.
Yeah, there was much more of a mom and pop feel to the client base at that time. It's definitely consolidated to this point. Even the folks that still run businesses like Elon Polo, I don't believe Elon Polo is still around, but even that part of the middleman, or the intermediary business, that's consolidated as well. I think there's only like 4 or 5 companies really left that are doing that for the majority of the discount or popular price, retail outlets that sell footwear.
I see. Okay, so you eventually you moved up to like an assistant lineman, and that's where the first opportunities for you to actually start overseas developed. Okay,
that's correct. Yes,
so
correct.
When you first got that, when you first were offered that, like, how did you react to it? I mean, like I think everyone could react in a variety of different ways, but
yeah, well, it was really quite exciting because at that particular point, I've been to Canada. Pretty much had not been outside the United States besides North America, Canada being the only country. So it was really quite exciting to be able to internationally travel in your 20s. That earlier on, like I said, was quite exciting, and it was really eye-opening. As I talked about in the previous episode, really changed the way I looked at things. Even from the very beginning, getting on the plane, getting off in Korea, having that experience with the garlic. But then later on, going primarily directly to Shanghai Shek Airport, in Taipei, and traveling probably the first handful of trips with mentors or with full line builders, and then towards the mid 90s, going by myself, because at that point in time, you establish your relationships. At that point, I was a full line builder myself, working, within a team. But at the same time, there was a lot more experience, a lot more of ability to then, make treks into China, do, factory inspection, types of things like that. But in the early years, the primary reason to go, was to learn the business from the standpoint of producing what we called samples. Because when you go into a client, you're not just going to say, well, this is the only type of footwear that you're going to buy. You had to take a line. That's line builder. So you build a whole line of product that hopefully you would sell out of maybe, 30 to 50 different, types of shoes in different categories that you would be able to sell maybe 5 to 10 or even less, depending on what the need was, from the retailer at that time. So you had to produce a lot of product to be able to sell something that would be mass produced.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, you have, it's not like you just go do one thing. It's a comprehensive process.
Yep. Yeah. And the line builder not only had to travel overseas, which is where these, lines of shoes were made in anticipation of the selling season. There was also a lot of domestic travel, to find out, what those trends were going to be. I can remember in the early days back in St. Louis, I don't think this mall is there anymore, but Crestwood Mall, we used to, in the early days, it wasn't so much we'd stop in a city on our way over there, but we would shop for product based on the time of the year, because they would schedule these trips in lieu of the selling season, and usually was quarter by quarter. Every quarter had their own selling season, which then subsequently you'd be producing and selling, be producing the samples and then actually selling them to the retailer. And then within a 4 to 6 month period, over 4 quarters throughout the year, is when that manufacturing would hit the store. You had like the spring season, fall season, and then the winter or the Christmas season. So you had to match up all your trips, sometimes multiple trips within those quarters, to match up with those selling seasons. So everything had to be ready. Earlier on, I remember when I was going on trips by myself, Taiwan primarily, you'd come back with like 5 to 6 huge bags full of samples. And going through customs was always a unique experience. And sometimes they would just wave you through, which was on the rare side. But other times, they would make you pull these bags apart and check what you had. And, these are non-sellable items, but they had to be damaged. You had to have an invoice, everything listed on there, what you had. And it couldn't be full pairs of shoes. It could only be like a right or a left, and it was usually a right. And there had to be a hole drilled through the bottom so that it could be damaged and not for resale.
Pretty much, they were, of course, are you trying to get all this through and sell it without declaring?
Right, yeah. Coming back with these 6 bags full of shoes, you had to show they were damaged. They were only one part of not a full pair. You had to have an invoice. And a lot of times, if the customs agent was having a bad day, they would end up charging you something for it. Usually wasn't a lot. So, all of us had, American Express cards, whatever, that we could pay that. It usually wasn't a big deal, but most of the time I would come through and not have to pay additional duty, is what they called it.
So more or less, like at first it was a little like, oh, this is a bit scary, but eventually it became kind of expected and just more of an inconvenience.
Well, it became the norm. Anytime you start something new, there's always that sense of wonder. There's that sense of newness. But as you move through that process, what was not normal before becomes normal. Like with Taiwan, it always struck me as, in the beginning, as kind of backwards. But when I got to China, it was like, wow, Taiwan's actually pretty modern by comparison. And that's probably because of the influence and their connections to the West in general and all the political stuff, that surrounded, their coming into being, and, how countries like our country, the United States, leverage them against China for certain negotiation reasons, whatever it may be. But earlier on, it was like, well, these people are kind of backward, but that's really not the case. Their culture, as we talked about before, is thousands of years old than most places in the West, especially in North America. So I think that as a young person experiencing that was, wow, this is so new, this is so different. But
so as I moved, it created like a sense of like fascination and like interest in you.
Oh, very much so. I was like, probably not unlike your experience, I was drawn into it. So the more that I went, the more confidence that I had in the job itself, my ability to travel alone in that respect, it opened up that whole palette of experience in a completely and incrementally different way, because you meet these people, but then the Taiwanese people are partners, are business partners. You develop not only business relationships with them, but personal relationships.
It feeds into like the kind of the core of our discussion today, is like understanding what those business relationships were like and how those business relationships also turned into those personal relationships.
Yeah. There was a lot of similarities. Some of the market differences were that Asian business professionals seemed to me at the time to be much more adept at networking. Now, that may be simply because I was I was young and just, experiencing international business in that particular way. And I was in the design and development department. I wasn't in the finance department. I wasn't in HR or anything like that. So I didn't get exposed to that part of the business world until much, much later on. But
that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, it's like people who their job is to go out and build specific partnerships, and that's all they do, versus who are designers. So there's definitely some skill sets that are different. But regardless, you're still going to learn bits and pieces of other aspects of the industry you're in just by doing your job.
Absolutely. And the part of it that I was involved in was with people who spoke English, because I didn't speak Taiwanese. And as you know, Taiwanese is a different dialect of Mandarin, just like Cantonese is a different dialect than Mandarin. So they spoke Mandarin, but they spoke Taiwanese and English as well. So there was, I think it gave me an opportunity to be able to refine my ability to articulate, because I had the ability as an artist to show. But when it came to the construction, the interior, architecture of the shoes, that was more difficult. I had to develop more drafting skills to be able to show how things were split out. Not only 3D, but 2D or cutaways, all that kind of stuff. How a human foot can be turned into a metal or plastic last, that would be appropriate for an athletic shoe, a casual shoe, a women's dress shoe, a children's, patent leather shoe. All those lasts were different. So there was a lot more. There's also pattern making. So it wasn't just, well, this is what the shoe looks like, make it. Well, no, this is what it looks like. Here's what the pattern has to be. Here's how the pieces have to fit together. Here's how the last has to be. How the last is going to affect the overall look. Is going to make the toe of the shoe too bulbous and the heel of it too thin. So it became it was scientific, but it was also very artistic. So I kind of got an opportunity to be able to see how arts and sciences can work together to create a product.
No, that's really neat, and and I'm sure, and overall, it's just interesting to see how all those components will fit together to create that. And then kind of going back to, like, the business relationships, like how would you say, like, from your trips, how did your business relationships develop, and like, what did you learn, and like what were the characteristics that you noticed about, like, versus doing business in the U.S.?
Well, language is a huge thing. Even though they spoke English, it wasn't to the same level and vocabulary, like lexicon, that it would be if you were to develop in the business community in the United States. So you had to cultivate simplicity in the way that you describe things. And there was a fun social quality to that, because as a proficient English speaker, you were able to kind of help them with their own vocabulary. They always wanted to learn the slang. Some of it I can't speak here on a particular part of the program, but they always wanted to learn that. And that was intimate to how those connections, the trust that you built with them, and that intuitive sense. When you send something over and you're not there to describe it, after a while I know what James wants. He's talked about this before. I know what he wants. He doesn't want this level of thickness and material, or he wants different compound used in this part of the outsole, the sole of the shoe. So I think the primary thing was language, how to navigate language, but also appreciate the fact that your business partners spoke the language that you spoke, and you didn't speak the one that they spoke.
I can totally relate, and having when I first went over to China, not knowing much Chinese, I definitely would respected them because they already learned a lot, and that really gave me the motivation to learn, and to the point where I can communicate relatively effectively. Now I still have a lot to learn, but like, wow, this is actually really difficult because I'm actually trying to do what they have done, and they're already ahead of you because they've been studying for years or even decades, depending on what their backgrounds are like. So it definitely gives you an appreciation, and that's why whenever I meet people who are like, "Oh, speak my language," it's like he's actually he or she is trying to speak your language. Just, knock it off.
Yeah. And on the other side of that, you start to develop what we would commonly refer to as a business relationship beyond just the language. Like I said, it becomes intuitive at some point, but it also becomes much more personal. So you start seeing the same types of interrelationships and interdynamics of people, regardless of the culture. The culture made it fascinating, but embedded within that culture was the same type of business relationships, and then to a certain extent, social relationships and friend relationships that you would anywhere else. So you pass through that cultural, I guess, facade, and land on the fact that, we have different, backgrounds, temperaments, talents, inventions, cultures, superstitions, whatever it may be. But at the end of the day, we're just human beings. Once I saw that clearly, the light went on.
Okay, that's when realization. This is a different place, different things, but we're still pretty much the same in our.
But that allowed me to be successful in that particular career until my career path changed. That light bulb going off, that recognition, was really the beginning of all the success that I had in the footwear business and the import business. That was the pivotal moment when I recognized that we were all just human beings, creating relationships with each other.
Yeah, and we all may have different ways of going about it because of where we're from and what influences us, but the goal at the end is always the same.
Yeah. One of the other things too was that I recognized how to be a better networker. I think I mentioned earlier on, or maybe just you before the program, that is another strength that Asian business people, in my opinion, have their ability to network.
I definitely agree with you on that.
Yeah, I learned a lot, not only about how to schmooze per se, but how to bring different things together so that the outcome, whether it was a supplier of a particular material, whether it was the textile person, the person that did the glue, PVC, the polyurethane, you got to bring all these people together from a standpoint of a timeline associated with production. Not only when you finally sold something, you went over to there to make sure that it was mass produced correctly. You had to make sure that everyone was in the loop and everyone understood. And you were pivotal to that because at any moment you could stop the production if it wasn't meeting the standards. That's how much power you had. But if you didn't apply it properly and learn from the networking, then you could cause a catastrophic financial problem.
I see. So a lot of weight in your actions and decisions and trying to navigate that, where if you did see a problem, you need to address it, but you don't want to do it to kind of damage the relationship.
Yeah, well, exactly. But you used and leveraged your networks and what I learned from them how to do that and avoided some really big problems that I attribute to learning how to network from an Asian perspective.
Oh, I definitely agree. I mean, that's something that you definitely can learn by doing business in that part of the world. And
I wouldn't have learned that if I hadn't gone and experienced it and done it.
Okay. And that kind of leads into another good area we can explore is like, can you describe like the types of activities, like business wise, like maybe the rituals or kind of the procedures that we would go, you guys, I mean, like I know business is business, but was there anything like unique or something that you thought you learned, or there was like a standard set of rules, regulations, however you want to call it, that you would expect or you came to become accustomed to?
Yeah, well, one of the things that's probably more commonly known in the West about Asian business practices and just the Asian mindset in general is that you want to avoid causing someone to lose face. So, from a business perspective, you had to learn how to be able to place people in a position where they would support you, even if they were the ones making the mistakes. So the communication interaction at that level happened in a very private environment, so that then that person once they were convinced and understood what the problem was and how we could fix it, it wasn't like you were throwing in their face in front of all their cohorts, their subordinates, and their leaders. They could actually come out and say, hey, we've made a breakthrough. This is what it's going to be, when it's actually was you and that person or group of people negotiating behind the scenes. Then everybody wins. Nobody loses face. And in that particular environment, losing face does not bode well for the future. And the business relationships and the things that you may need to get that person or people to do will probably not ever happen unless you do some kind of serious reparation to heal that relationship.
Yeah, I think that's one thing a lot of people, Americans or people who are not from that part of the world, they don't realize how important face or Chinese mianzi is and how it can be like, a life or death for a lot of people. And literally a lot of people lose face to too much or too severe of a degree. I mean, I've heard of people committing suicide over it because it's such a.
Oh yeah, very much so.
It's frightening, but it's something you have to realize, and something like you said, you have to learn how to figure in and kind of craft to, it's something not naturally. It's an acquired skill set you have to learn.
It definitely is, and it happened over a period of time. It just didn't happen like that. It happened over a period of years. But what it afforded me was relationships that I still have today. And even when I was in transition between the insurance industry and the import business, footwear business, I was able to continue to have employment because of that.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, I mean, connection.
So it can powerful relationships that will endure potentially for the rest of your life. Some of these people I still have connection with.
That's excellent, and I think that's one thing a lot of people, fail to do is maintain relationships. It's really important. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes, you need to be proactive, but it really can pay dividends in the long term, not just for yourself, but for both parties.
Yeah. Again, the lessons that anyone would learn, as they would effectively and progressively move through any business career, you learn there. It's the subtleties of how you learn it and the cultural impact of how that will change your perception if you were to ever not work in that, like myself. It created a skill set in me, which allowed me to now be successful as an insurance professional.
I see.
And what I would have never had if I hadn't gone through that.
Yeah, so I mean, if you could, in a nutshell, what would you suggest are some tips or useful things that you would recommend for anyone who wants to kind of do something in the business field in Asia, or primarily China and Taiwan, from your experience?
I would say, first of all, be completely open to what the experience can impart to you, depending on your age. Obviously, if you're younger, you're going to have potentially a little easier time with this, maybe. If you're a little older, I think you're going to have to recognize that what you did before won't work initially. Learn what it is, learn the landscape. And the landscape over there is about relationships. It's about protecting integrity. It's about networking. It's about being humble. It's about, I think one of the greatest things that impressed the people that became my friends over there, as well as business associates, is because I was open to learn it their way. It wasn't like I was coming over there like the ugly American in a bull in a china shop. You're going to do it this way. It's my way or the highway. I went in there. How can I help you? How can I learn from you? And how can we work together to create something that will be successful for all of us? I was open to learn. That's the biggest piece of advice that I would give anyone that would have an opportunity to do that.
Yeah,
Go over there, completely open,
flexible.
Yes, I think it was, who was it? Might have been Stephen Hawking that says that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change.
Oh, I definitely agree with and I think a lot of people really struggle with that for a wide range of reasons.
Yeah, and there are people that failed utterly because they did not do that.
I'm sure. I mean, because you said you traveled with other people, and I'm sure you saw the extent people kind of could do that versus on a pendulum, like how far could they go versus how far we're like, nope, I can't. It's just like they can't do it.
Yeah, there was the people that went over there the most, like I did, and people like me had those qualities. If you were, quote, a big shot but really didn't have those qualities, you were only over there for key periods of time because they had a reputation. People like myself and other people who did a lot of that type of work and were there multiple times, 6-8 times a year, for 2 to 4 weeks, maybe 5 in some respects. They were there because those people liked us, because they could work with us, because they knew that when we came over there that we wouldn't be carrying some type of chip, that we wanted to be involved in the experience with them, to work with them, not to make them be something that they weren't.
Hence, they recognized you were flexible and that you understood them, and by understanding them, you could do better business with them. While you still have your agenda you have to follow, you can still adapt and make sure you're not imposing anything on them that it makes them uncomfortable or difficult to do, and therefore you can maintain that smooth business relationship so both parties can benefit financially, and also in terms of of appearance and whatever else. Yeah,
it became a true, to use that, I think it's the Greek word, the dialectic. It became a dialectic. They appreciated that experience as much as I did. So therefore, when is James coming back over so we can work on this project?
And also, I'm sure, like you said, it built up an increased amount of general curiosity about it for each other over time, and.
Well, it led to some amazing, when you weren't working, it led to some amazing interpersonal relationships, an immersion into a culture, that probably would have never had the opportunity if I wasn't invited.
I see. So yeah, and that's, I think, especially from my experience, that's something you really need to take advantage of. Don't just stop at the business level. If they invite you to do things or offer things, definitely take them up on it. I mean, of course, use good judgment, but definitely, as I say, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Do it.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, absolutely. But you won't. My humble opinion, you won't get to that point. From the business angle or business partnership angle, if you don't have the things we've talked about on this podcast.
exactly, and people can tell, like, when you're doing business or doing whatever, if you're doing your job, but you're also showing interest in them, where their culture, whatever. That's when maybe the other party is like, okay, this person, maybe we could do something outside of work because they have expressed an interest, and then if they do offer that, you take it, then okay, perfect, and then from there it's like a snowball effect.
Yeah, at least for me, it made for a better business relationship because we were able to cross that barrier or that line of demarcation from pure business to social to friendship in many cases.
That's I completely agree with you, and that's a really neat thing. Now, when it comes to like the business like layout, was it always very formal or was it more informal? Like in the U.S., it's formal, but I know in Asia it can be very more ceremonial to an extent.
Yeah, there was definitely more of the ceremonial part of it, but I think that those ceremonies were more so in the public. The more public the organization was, the more the ceremonial.
Sure.
We're not so much in the public eye. It was a relaxed environment because it was mostly creative people and business folks, who were more into playing hard as much as working hard. So it wasn't like a political type of thing. That was a quality, but it really, I didn't experience as much as the ceremonial part as I did. The purely cultural. What is your life on a daily basis after outside the office? But within the office, it was pretty regimented. The way that they structured in Taiwan, at least in the early days. It was much more of a hierarchical process that was more rigid than what I was used to in the United States. So I had one person that I worked with as the liaison, and everything that I needed help with was a part of his or her network. I could go and talk to those other people. I could interact with them, but it was all through primarily, hey, Johnny, I'm going to go talk to Melissa, or I'm going to talk to Superman, because they had interesting English names.
Oh, that's for sure. When I was over there, yeah.
I'm going to go talk to him because I need some help with this. Can you come and introduce me or get me started off? That way, I was maintaining the hierarchy, which was very important to their situation. We have that in the States, but in my experiences, it was much more rigid. And you had to make sure that your liaison was involved in every part of it until that person didn't want to be.
No, I completely agree. And I think maybe a little difference that from our experiences, I was in more the education, more of a formalized environment. So when they would do stuff, it was a little more formal. I mean, of course, there were many things that were informal, but like the university environment, or like when we go to because I had studied international relations, we went to some city summits about it was more, and some of the business things I did see, they were definitely formal, but I could also see kind of more of the informality. But it was definitely, I think, more of my experiences were more formal most of the time.
Yeah, they were there. I would say the most formal parts of my experience were when we were working with a new supplier or an existing supplier. More of the new ones, because it was all about dinner. It was all about the interaction that happened over dinner. So that was formal. As you get to establish relationships with suppliers or people that you work with on a regular basis that weren't part of the organization but connected to it, it became more and more less formal as a result. But it started off very formal, but not really.
First impressions, the first impression you want to, you want to be very, like on your A game, and then from there you kind of gets more relaxed as you get to know each other.
Yeah, I got with some of the people that I worked with for many years that were not part of the organizations that I were a part of, but they were the suppliers. They had the business relationship. Things got very informal over time.
Yeah, I remember you told me about those, which we'll do on another episode. And I think that's another thing that things definitely can go well beyond things in the States will kind of can lead into most of the time, I would say. And I've had some similar situations like that where I was like, oh wow, I didn't expect this, but okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I think the bottom line is that you're going to have a similar business paradigm of interactions anywhere you go in the world. You have to be open to the nuance and the subtlety of how the culture formed that. If you're able to cross over that line of demarcation, then not only are you going to learn basic and advanced skills of business relationships and developing networks, etc., but you're going to learn it from the palette of something, a different culture, which changes it, intrinsically changes it. So when you come back to your own, you're a different person. You have different skill sets than if someone who would have done the same process, but exclusively within the United States.
And, that's another thing, like you can bring a little psychology into it. Like you can learn how to code switch in a way, as they say.
Oh yeah. Yes.
You can like be different, personas in a way based on the situation. And you don't, you can do that in the U.S. or your own country, but when you go overseas or overseas and different types of people and cultures, as we mentioned, that's when you really learn how to you can enter your facade or your mannerisms, behavior much more effectively to meet the situation. And the people who can do that very well can be very successful. The other people have a harder time doing that, as you mentioned.
Definitely. It makes you more international in the truest form, in the truest definition of the word.
No, and I definitely agree. I mean, I think both of us, from our combined experiences, we're definitely more internationalized now from our experiences abroad, compared to someone who never leaves their home country or they don't go overseas enough to kind of absorb more aspects of wherever they visit.
And I would go as far to say is, again, in my humble opinion, it makes me, and probably you and anyone else in a similar situation, it makes us have a greater appreciation for the world community and not just the sometimes xenophobic perspectives that seem to be raising their heads in the West these days.
Oh, I completely agree with that. And you also learn how to think about things from different points of view, and you also realize what other places think of people's countries. Their perspective is like, oh, I never thought about that from that angle. Or you learn how others think about your country, your politics, whatever, and vice versa, and they can learn the same thing. Oh, you think that? Oh, wow, I never thought about that. And I think that's a really useful lesson or just useful experiences, because now you get a sense of what different places, how they think about where you're from, and so many different aspects. And that really gives you an advantage, because when you go back home and people say like, yeah, but they think about it like this. And unless you actually meet them, go here and do this, do that, you're not going to understand that, because, everyone has their own way of thinking. Some people are more broad-minded or narrow-minded, but unless you actually go and meet people from different places, that's when it just over time will broaden your mindset, and you will learn to think like, you learn to walk in their shoes and learn to think the way they think. Apply that
I think
yourself.
You bring up I think a very important secondary point to that. If you, in my opinion, have the right attitude towards that, you're not going to see it as a usatory relationship. You're going to see that as an immersive relationship. That's what creates what you're describing. Because there's plenty of people that just go over there and, for lack of a better word, rape the situation. It's a harsh word.
They completely exploit it. They don't learn from it. They just go do what they want to do.
Yeah. If you go with an immersive type attitude, then it changes you in the way you're describing.
Hence, that's why I'm doing this podcast, because it's about immersion.
Yeah, that's right. Because otherwise, you could go over there and learn absolutely nothing if you don't have that attitude.
Exactly.
One of the big things in business that's universal is the one thing you can control is your attitude. So if you choose not to apply it in an immersive way, you're not going to learn the things we're talking about, and they will make no sense to the people potentially listening to this podcast.
Exactly. It's like, I think one Greek philosopher, Epictetus, said, he said, you have two ears and one mouth. Twice you can do twice as much listening as speaking.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's some serious ancient wisdom.
Yeah, and I think it's very true. And when you go over it, you definitely need to kind of zip it to an extent and just absorb before you kind of don't draw conclusions too prematurely. And I think that's what a lot of people unfortunately do. And I know both have seen that, on numerous occasions.
So I certainly did in the earlier years, but I chose to learn from those experiences when they were uncomfortable. I was outside my comfort zone. I tried to, ask why and how I could make that something that was useful to me and have it become the new normal.
Exactly. Yeah, Dad, I think everything we've discussed today is, I think very spot on, and I think very, very useful for people who want to kind of do a profession or who are in a profession who want to go over and interact with different cultures, education, whatever. These lessons definitely apply, and you should heed them, or at least heed some aspects of them. Otherwise, your chance to be successful and to learn is going to be diminished, exponentially.
Yeah, well, you won't get the fullness of the experience. You may get part of it, but you won't allow necessarily yourself to get the most out of it.
Exactly. Yeah, and before we end for the day, would you have any other thoughts or opinions you want to share real fast about, the kind of discussing the nature of business that you've done, and the relationships that you cultivated?
No, only that I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to go. I mean, this is something that I could never afford. It was through the business that allowed me to do this. So in taking advantage of it, I wanted it to be something that was not only meaningful for me, but that would have a financially progressive and positive impact on the companies that I was with. So that was very much in the forefront of my mind as well, because I wanted to continue to have the experience. So to have the experience on that personal level, I had to produce, I had to execute, I had to make it work. So having that immersive perspective allowed me to do both.
No, I totally agree. And I think, they say, carpe diem, seize the day. And, especially when you started doing this, you were young. And when I had my opportunity, I was very young. When you're young, you're not tied down. You don't have as many things that are, holding you in any place. Do it. Go for it. You have nothing to lose.
Yeah, opportunity. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Dad, I really appreciate you talking to me today. And it's always fun to kind of, reminisce on these things, compare our own stories. And I think people like, I mentioned, can gain a lot of insight from this and apply it to their, personal lives, careers, whatever. So. Yeah,
absolutely. And I appreciate the opportunity to share it. And between you and I, this is a great opportunity to share experiences that maybe either one of us didn't necessarily know the full details on, which is awesome.
Exactly.
Or my grandmother would say, awesome sauce. Or my
as she does say. So, well, Dad, it's been a pleasure. And, this has been another episode of International Immersion. Please let us know if you have any questions, if you have content that you would like us to discuss. Shoot us an email at internationalimmersionpodcast@gmail.com. And we'll see you on the next episode.
Bye everybody. Thank you.